Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're uncovering the hidden drama of plants. You know, when we look out at a quiet garden or a forest, it seems like, well, nothing is really happening. But down on a cellular level, plant reproduction is surprisingly complex. It is action-packed and full of biological twists and turns you probably wouldn't expect.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover our objectives, the alternation of generations, flower anatomy, a model of pollination, run through a few quick checks, and finish up with a recap.
Starting off with our objectives for plant reproduction.
By the end of this session, you should be able to do three main things. First, understand the alternation of generation cycle, which is basically how plants fundamentally live and reproduce. Second, identify the exact anatomy and organs of a flower. And third, track the specific steps of pollination, ending with a super unique biological process called double fertilization. Moving on to the alternation of generations, and really, the hidden drama of plants. So the truth is, unlike humans who are always just diploid, plants actually alternate between two completely different physical forms over their life cycle. First up is the gametophyte phase. This is haploid, meaning its cells only have one set of chromosomes. We represent that with the letter N. The gametophyte's whole job is to produce gametes, so sperm and egg cells. Then you have the sporophyte phase. This one is diploid, meaning it has two sets of chromosomes, or 2N, and the sporophyte's job to produce spores. Let's look at how this builds into a continuous four-step cycle. Step 1. The haploid gametophyte produces sperm and egg cells by mitosis. In step 2, fertilization happens when the sperm and egg join together, and that creates a diploid zygote. Now for step 3, that zygote develops into the diploid sporophyte, which then produces haploid spores through meiosis. And finally, in step 4, those haploid spores go through mitosis and develop into a brand new haploid gametophyte, starting the entire cycle all over again. The plant is literally alternating from generation to generation.
Next up, the anatomy of a flower, specifically focusing on the reproductive organs.
A typical flower has 4 main organs, and each one has a very specific, crucial job. The sepals are those leaf-like structures at the base that protect the developing flower bud. The petals, which are usually super vibrant and colorful, well, their job is to attract pollinators. But the actual reproduction, that happens in the next 2 structures, the stamen, which holds the male reproductive parts, and the pistil, which holds the female reproductive parts. Let's isolate the male parts first. The stamen is made up of 2 main pieces. There's the filament, which is basically just a supportive stalk, and sitting at the very top of that stalk is the anther. The anther is this fluffy structure that produces pollen. So, when you see yellow dust on a flower, or, covering a bumblebee, that is pollen produced right there in the anther. Now for the female parts. The pistil is right in the center of the flower, and usually has 3 parts. At the very top is the stigma. I actually like to call it the sticky stigma, because it literally catches and holds on to the pollen. Right below that is the style, which is this long stalk the pollen will eventually travel down. And at the very base is the ovary. This is where fertilization actually occurs and where the seeds are ultimately formed.
All right, let's look at a model of pollination and track the actual journey of the pollen.
The journey starts with pollination. Picture a swarm of bees. Actually, in one wild anecdote, a biologist discovered a whole colony of honeybees nesting directly in her house's insulation and later above her son's ceiling. But why do we love these house-invading bees? Well, because they are absolutely essential pollinators. When a bee lands on a flower to drink sweet nectar, it accidentally brushes up against those fluffy anthers, getting totally covered in yellow pollen dust. It then flies over to the next flower and brushes that pollen right onto the sticky stigma. That is step 1. Step 2. A tube cell in the pollen grain literally burrows a pollen tube all the way down the style. And step 3, the sperm cells travel down that newly built tube directly into the ovule inside the ovary.
And this brilliantly illustrates a concept completely unique to flowering plants: double fertilization. It's called double fertilization because, well, the process actually involves 2 sperm cells. Once they travel down that pollen tube, the first sperm cell fertilizes the egg to form a diploid zygote, which is our new baby plant. But a second sperm cell joins with 2 polar nuclei that are also just hanging out in the ovule. This creates a triploid cell that develops into the endosperm. Think of the endosperm as a nutrient-packed food supply for the developing seed. 2 fertilizations, 1 amazing result.
This really maps out that entire angiosperm life cycle we just walked through. We start with the pollen grain landing on the stigma, the pollen tube traveling down the style, and double fertilization happening down in the ovary. But notice what happens next. Once fertilized, the ovule itself develops into a seed. Meanwhile, the surrounding ovary ripens and develops into a fruit. The fruit provides a way to protect and eventually disperse those seeds so the whole cycle can start again.
Let's do a few quick checks and clear up some super common biological misconceptions.
I want you to think about this for a second. Do all plants have flowers?
The answer is no. While flowering plants, or angiosperms, make up about 90% of plant species, they definitely aren't the only ones out there. Early plants, like mosses and ferns, never produce flowers, and they don't produce seeds either. Instead, they rely on spores for reproduction. Some, like bryophytes, even have sperm cells that physically need to swim through water to reach the egg.
Okay, let's try another one. Here's kind of a surprising question. Is a peanut a fruit?
Biologically speaking, yes, absolutely. In biology, a fruit is simply the ripened ovary of a flowering plant. While we usually think of sweet, fleshy things like apples or oranges, many fruits are actually dry. Rice, peanuts, pumpkins, and green beans all developed from the ovary of a flower, which makes them biological fruits. No way, right?
Now for a quick formative check, just to test your vocabulary retention from earlier. Which flower organ is the female reproductive structure where seeds are formed?
If you guess the pistil, you are correct. The pistil is the full female structure, and the ovary at the very base is that crucial site where fertilization occurs and where the seeds are ultimately formed. Great job if you remembered that one.
Finally, let's jump into our recap of plant reproduction. So the crucial point here is that plant reproduction is highly dynamic. We've seen how plants cycle through the alternation of generations, shifting between those haploid gametophytes and diploid sporophytes. We mapped out the flower's anatomy, looking specifically at the male stamen and female pistil. We explored the brilliant process of double fertilization in angiosperms. And finally, we learned that after fertilization, the ovule becomes the seed while the ovary ripens into a fruit. The hidden life of plants is truly incredible. So, the next time you take a bite of an apple, a pumpkin, or even a peanut, ask yourself, what part of the flower's hidden reproductive drama are you actually eating? Thanks for joining this explainer.